What if I told you that the most resplendent king in European history, the monarch who constructed Versailles and governed like a deity, concluded his days as a putrefying, toothless mass of flesh that no one could endure standing beside? This is a concealed reality behind Louis XIV of France. The man they hailed as the Sun King was not merely a sovereign. He was the most physically flawless monarch Europe had ever witnessed. Standing at 5'9" with a sculpted frame, radiant skin, and jet-black curls that cascaded like silk, Louis was magnetic. He could perform ballet for 6 hours without perspiring. And when he passed, foreign diplomats literally forgot how to speak. But here's the portion the chronicles never reveal. That same gilded deity of Versailles would ultimately become a bloated 100-kilogram wreck, decaying alive from gangrene. His breath festered so horribly that even perfumed court masks could not conceal it. The odor made foreign envoys retch in the midst of royal audiences. I possess medical records, genuine concealed documents that track this horrifying metamorphosis, secrets French historians have attempted to inter for over 4 centuries. So, if you are prepared to uncover what truly occurred inside the gilded walls of Versailles, pledge your alliance to sinister empires, so this shocking reality is not expunged from memory. Because what I am about to disclose will transform everything you believed you understood about European royalty. Picture it. A marble staircase glistening under golden light. A 23-year-old king descends, draped in a ceremonial robe embroidered with pure gold thread. It weighs 15 kilograms, but he bears it like feathers. 5,000 nobles hold their breath as Louis XIV, every inch a living statue, walks past a corridor of Venetian mirrors. The reflections multiply his presence, rendering him a divine force. Sunlight floods through crystal windows, painting his already luminous skin in an angelic shimmer. His voice, deep, commanding, and clear, carried across the entire hall. Courtiers claimed his sapphire blue eyes felt like falling stars piercing your very soul. His stride was so potent that the wooden floors of Versailles trembled with each step. And then there was a scent, not of perfume, but of something primal, masculine, magnetic. Even hardened noblemen found themselves stupefied when he passed. But Louis was not merely a handsome face with royal lineage. He was something far more perilous. Fluent in 5 languages, French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German, Louis XIV was a prodigy. By age 20, he could outduel his Italian sword masters, men regarded as the finest in all of Europe. He was not just strong, he was indefatigable. He could perform an entire ballet and then compose a poem that moved hardened diplomats to tears. British Ambassador Nathaniel Cole once wept openly after hearing one of Louis's verses recited in court. And Louis's stamina was peerless. Official records show he consumed 4 full meals and 3 snacks daily, yet maintained a muscular, athletic physique. He would hunt wild boar in the forest surrounding Versailles for 8 hours straight, and then dance until 3 in the morning. Not once did he complain of fatigue. His memory bordered on the supernatural. Louis XIV could recall the names and faces of over 3,000 courtiers, along with details of their families, ambitions, and even mistresses. And speaking of mistresses, his legendary appetite was not confined to food. Confidential court notes state he maintained intimate relations with at least 12 different women every month. Foreign envoys were entranced. One Venetian diplomat described his charisma as otherworldly. When Louis entered a room, conversations ceased, pulses raced, and even his foes were rendered speechless. This was the golden age of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV was its gleaming centerpiece. Each morning, over 100 nobles vied for the honor of handing Louis his silk shirt. They competed to hold his mirror, to pour his water, to tie his laces. Even his bedtime was a spectacle. Grown men battled for the right to extinguish his candle at night. Versailles itself was never merely a palace. It was a meticulously orchestrated stage for a divine performance. 10,000 courtiers dwelled within its walls, their every gesture scripted to elevate the king's image. When Louis promenaded to the Hall of Mirrors, the endless reflections crafted the illusion of a god moving through time itself. Even the marble beneath his feet was imported from Italy at an astronomical cost, so that each step echoed with imperial dominance. But even in these glittering years, faint indications of decay had begun to surface. In 1687, a sealed set of documents from Louis's court physician was finally decoded. They revealed disquieting truths that everyone surrounding the king elected to ignore. By the time he was 20, Louis required 2 to 3 enemas per day simply to relieve himself. His chronic constipation was caused by eating 6 to 8 times daily, an excessive consumption that no physique, royal or otherwise, was fashioned to withstand. And there were other portents of doom. His breath grew so fetid he perpetually sucked mint lozenges to cloak the odor. His skin turned oily and pitted with acne, which he slathered in layers of lead-white powder and rouge. And his digestion, a daily catastrophe demanding relentless medical intervention. Yet none of this reached the public eye. A fortress of courtly ritual ensured that frailty appeared as ceremony, and medical desperation was staged as divine tradition. Perhaps the most damning detail, however, was this. Louis XIV refused to bathe. Each day, he washed only his hands and face. That was all. His body was scrubbed perhaps twice in his entire lifetime. This was not laziness. It was conviction. In that era, many believed water weakened the body or invited evil spirits. Louis was convinced his natural bodily odor was a signature of masculine vigor and celestial favor. That single decision to treat water like a pestilence would become the spark that ignited his ruin. For in January of 1686, something began to fester in the darkest, dampest recesses of his body. Something terrifying. And that is where the nightmare truly commences. January 15th, 1686. Louis XIV is now 47 years old. The radiant Sun King, once the living emblem of perfection, begins to feel discomfort. Not agony, not even sharp pain, just a slight unease when seated. Yet it was enough to summon his personal physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, a man whose treatments had already claimed more lives than the plague. Dr. Fagan examined the king and declared the issue a simple one. Hemorrhoids. Asterisk, it was not hemorrhoids. Asterisk. This moment marked the beginning of a 30-year spiral into horror, anguish, and humiliation, a nightmare that would slowly consume the most powerful man in Europe from the inside out. Within a week, that minor discomfort transformed into a stabbing agony, like a searing dagger lodged near his spine. By January 22nd, a swelling the size of a walnut had formed. 6 days later, it began to bleed incessantly. Louis was now forced to hold court while seated on soft cushions. By February 5th, palace staff detected a new, unfamiliar odor clinging to the king's robes, sharp and putrid. By February 12th, an external abscess had formed, oozing pus and feces around the clock. Imagine the worst infection you have ever conceived, now multiplied 100-fold. That was now the reality of Louis XIV's body. The stench grew so potent that diplomats requested early dismissals from court. Some retched in their chairs. Versailles, once the embodiment of glory, began to reek of decay. Dr. Fagan's response? Medieval torture disguised as treatment. He began by ordering multiple enemas every single day, cold water, sometimes infused with herbs. Over 6 months, Louis endured more than 2,000 enemas as Fagan desperately tried to purge the royal intestines. When that failed, they turned to hot irons. Metal rods were heated to a glowing crimson and applied directly to the infected flesh. The king was pinned down by his own courtiers while he screamed, shrieks that echoed 3 stories down into the gilded halls. Still, the infection advanced. So they commenced daily bloodletting, draining over half a liter of the king's blood each day to balance his humors. Instead of healing, Louis withered, his body buckling under the weight of torment and delusion. Then came the potions. Charlatans from across France arrived with grotesque remedies. Bull semen mixed with wine, crushed pearls dissolved in cow's blood, frog fat infused into brandy. Each was more bizarre and foul than the last. Yet Louis, desperate to preserve his divine image, swallowed them all. By November 1686, the palace could no longer conceal the horror. The odor alone had become a diplomatic crisis. Something drastic had to be done. It was then the king's life was entrusted to a man who had never performed this kind of surgery before. Enter Charles Francois Felix, the king's personal barber turned surgeon. He was now tasked with the unthinkable, to operate on the most powerful monarch in Europe's infected rectal fistula, with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no margin for error. Success would make him a legend. Failure would mean his execution. So Felix prepared. For weeks, he practiced his technique on 75 prisoners and volunteers, operating on live, conscious men with makeshift tools, refining a single, precise motion. He even designed a custom silver scalpel, curved specifically to navigate the most intimate corridors of the king's body. Then arrived the day that would alter history. At 6 a.m., under a veil of secrecy, the surgery began within the king's private chambers. There was no anesthesia, only 4 loyal nobles to hold Louis down, and a thick piece of wood for him to bite when the pain became unbearable. For the next 3 hours, the palace echoed the unfiltered, guttural screams of a man being carved open from within. Felix sliced through the infected flesh, meticulously tracing the fistula's canal. To witness the full, harrowing aftermath of this operation, the decade of suffering it failed to cure, and the ultimate, grotesque fate of the Sun King, ensure you are sworn to sinister empires. We delve deeper where others turn away. Asterisk, asterisk. As the scalpel reached the deepest recess of the abscess, a torrent of pus and decay erupted from the wound. 2 assistants retched on the spot and fled the chamber. Blood saturated the linens. Louis's teeth splintered the wooden gag. When the blade scraped his tailbone, he shrieked a single guttural word. Asterisk, mon Dieu, asterisk, his first audible cry of utter helplessness in years. The concealed surgical notes, unearthed only in 2007, describe over 200 milliliters of blue-green pus. The stench resembled a battlefield corpse left in the sun, bits of tissue sloughed away, revealing bone blackened by necrosis. Yet the nightmare was far from finished. Though the surgery concluded at 9:15 a.m., the wound refused to heal. The infection had tunneled too deep. The damage was too profound. One operation became 4. December 6th, a second surgery. December 8th, a third. December 10th, the final, most brutal procedure. It lasted 6 hours, while 6 men restrained the king as Felix carved away dead flesh with blades and forceps. Altogether, they excised so much decayed tissue it could fill a wine goblet. Louis XIV endured 15 hours of surgery over 3 weeks, awake, screaming, bleeding. But even after all that, the wound continued to fester. The king now lived with a permanent anal fistula. Pus and feces seeped from his body every single day for the remainder of his life. He wore absorbent pads beneath his robes, and his scent, once described as magnetic, now evoked death itself. In a desperate attempt to cloak the odor, Louis XIV launched what would become the most expensive perfume campaign in human history. He spent the modern equivalent of $2 million per year on fragrances, Bulgarian rose, Arabian amber, Indian sandalwood, imported from every corner of the known world. Versailles was transformed into a scent factory. Fresh flowers were placed every 2 hours. Aromatic smoke pumped into every chamber. Perfumed cloths draped every chair he might use. Even his food was soaked in scented oils. But all the perfumes in the world could not mask the truth. For beneath the silks and satin, behind the divine rituals and ceremonies, Louis XIV had become a rotting monument to human decay, and his body had only just begun to unravel. By the early 1690s, the once glorious physique of the Sun King had morphed into something monstrous. His weight ballooned from 77 kilograms at his prime to over 140 kilograms. His throne had to be rebuilt 3 times to bear his mass. He could no longer mount a horse without the aid of 6 strong men. Court artists received strict orders to paint him only from specific, flattering angles. But visiting dignitaries were not deceived. One Russian ambassador sneered that the French king smelled fouler than my stable and waddled like a gravid sow. Then came the dental catastrophe of 1693. His physicians, convinced all sickness originated in the mouth, decided to extract every single tooth in one brutal session. No anesthesia, no surgical precision, just iron tools and raw force. What followed was butchery. The extraction shattered Louis's upper jaw and fractured the lower. A fistula formed between his mouth and nasal cavity, causing wine and food to erupt from his nose. Whenever he ate, his speech slurred into near incomprehensibility. Courtiers had to lean into his fetid breath merely to decipher his commands. From his now toothless maw, saliva dripped incessantly. Combined with his leaking fistula and profound obesity, Louis XIV had mutated into a slobbering, gasping, reeking parody of the divine monarch he once proclaimed to be. Yet, somehow, the spectacle continued. Versailles responded with its timeless tools, ritual and deception. More than 200 new court protocols were invented, not to honor the king but to conceal him. A color-coded ribbon system was instituted. Red ribbons. Avoid the king. He is in agony. White ribbons. Approach only with scented masks. Black ribbons. Do not enter. His condition is catastrophic. The famed 2-hour lever, morning ritual, was slashed to 30 minutes to limit exposure to his odor. The nighttime coucher was altered to let servants discreetly insert fresh absorbing cloths into his undergarments. Heavy curtains were arranged to hide the changing of his soiled linens. Even the palace windows were open on a precise schedule to steer the foul air away from visitors. Every hour, 500 fresh flowers were delivered, and 50-cent machines operated without pause to smother the reek of decay. And the courtiers, they adapted. Each noble was required to carry a pomander, a decorative orb filled with spices, and perfume to hold beneath their nose during royal audiences. Some guests breathed through perfumed rags. Ladies of the court routinely excused themselves mid-ceremony to vomit in private, blaming fainting spells or feminine discomfort. Even diplomacy began to fracture. The final descent, the decades of concealed agony, the collapse of an empire built on divine illusion, awaits. To witness the unflinching conclusion, you must join the archives of sinister empires. The truth does not sanitize itself. Asterisk, asterisk. The English ambassador began demanding all audiences with the king be held outdoors, citing health concerns. The Spanish envoys started dispatching junior diplomats in his stead. Whispers snaked across Europe. Could the Sun King truly rule if he could not command his own bowels? And yet, Louis XIV clung to absolute power with vengeance. The more his body betrayed him, the more ferociously he performed his divine role. Every ritual, every council, every decree became a desperate mask to shield the world from the truth. Their god-king was dying. August 11, 1715. For colon 38, M. Asterisk, asterisk, a scream tore through the pre-dawn silence of Versailles. Louis XIV's left leg burned as if held to a flame. Dr. Fagin, now 72 and nearly blind, declared it sciatica. He was wrong. By August 15th, black spots mottled the king's big toe. By the 18th, the skin seared to the touch. And by August 22nd, a new odor invaded the palace. Not of pus or feces, but of putrefying flesh. Dry gangrene had taken hold. Modern diagnosis confirms an advanced necrotic condition, a lethal cocktail of poor circulation and untreated infection. Yet no one dared suggest amputation. Who would sever the limb of a man anointed by God himself? By August 25th, the necrotic tissue had climbed halfway up his calf. Courtiers began fainting upon entering his chamber. The stench now saturated 3 entire floors of Versailles. On August 28th, during a routine changing of his dressings, the king's blackened toe detached and dropped to the floor. A courtier collapsed at the sight of the exposed, white bone jutting from a sea of black, sloughing skin. By August 30th, gangrene had consumed his shin. His flesh disintegrated in chunks, seeping fluids no medicine could staunch. The Sun King had become a living corpse. Yet, impossibly, he still ruled. Even as his body rotted, Louis XIV signed decrees with with a trembling hand. He issued military orders in a rasping whisper while the infection crept toward his throat. A Venetian ambassador wrote, asterisk, "The French king dies before our very eyes." Asterisk, an Austrian representative, called it the most grotesque spectacle ever witnessed. Still, courtiers entered. Still, they bowed, but now they wore scented masks. Linens were changed every 2 hours. A team of 20 servants worked in shifts merely to manage the fluids leaking from his ruin. Some begged for reassignment. Others fled in horror. Even from the palace gardens, visitors could smell the king. Physicians and diplomats journeyed from across Europe, not to aid, but to witness this unprecedented royal death in real time. They documented every stage of Louis's living decomposition in letters and official reports. By September 1st, the infection reached his throat. He could barely speak. Summoning his great-grandson, the boy who would become Louis XV, he grated a final warning, asterisk, "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." Asterisk, his voice was sandpaper on rust. They were among his last coherent words. At 8:15 a.m., September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV, the Sun King, was finally gone. But the horror did not end. Within hours, the gangrene returned with vengeance. His abdomen bloated with the gases of decomposition. His skin blackened. His half-decayed throat began to ooze. Doctors rushed to perform an autopsy just 6 hours after death. Any longer, and the body would be too far gone. The findings were staggering. His entire left side gangrenous, throat muscles liquefied, intestines swollen to twice their size, a parasitic worm, 1/2 meter long, found coiled within his colon. The embalmers failed. Even working behind perfumed masks, several vomited and fled. The decay was too rapid, the stench unbearable. The coffin was sealed immediately, reinforced with lead and interred in haste. During the funeral, attendees heard strange pops and gurgles as the king's body, now a bag of gas and fluid, continued to collapse upon itself. But the illusion had to be preserved. The French court announced a peaceful passing after a brief illness. They burned Dr. Fagin's records, buried Felix's surgical notes for 3 centuries, and locked the autopsy away in secret archives. All evidence that the divine Sun King had died a putrid, grotesque mass of human decay was erased from public memory. Louis XIV ruled for 72 years, the longest reign in European history. He built the most magnificent palace on earth, demanded absolute obedience, and declared himself a state, appointed by God. But in the end, he died more miserably than a starving peasant. His divine body rotted while his mind remained trapped inside, fully conscious of the horror. The man who made nobles battle for the honor of handing him his shirt, who was worshipped by thousands, ended utterly alone, foul and piece by piece, coming apart. No perfume could cloak it. No ritual could disguise it. No title could halt it. His death was a final, grotesque testament. Beneath the gold and the gospel, every empire, no matter how radiant, is built upon flesh. And flesh always betrays its master. This is the legacy hidden behind the gilded frame. If you seek the truths history tries to bury, you must subscribe to sinister empires. Asterisk, asterisk. Even kings cannot escape the truth of flesh, rot, and mortality. Remember, the grandest throne still rests upon a foundation of bone. Thank you for bearing witness. Until the next investigation, stand vigilant. Sinister empires awaits. Asterisk, asterisk.